phrase acoustical visions, because I became really interested in the relationship between what I hear and what I see. And I also started combining moving image with sound. But I wanted to share with you a sound I just recorded about an hour ago. I put a vibration sensor, a kind of measuring instrument called a seismic accelerometer, on the Richard Serra sculpture to record the sound of the Serra sculpture just reacting to ambient sound outside. And this is what.
I just wanted to hear how your voice was, because it bounces around me.
Yeah, was it okay?
You're interested in sound, so.
Where are the
this
speakers?
space is pretty
Where are the
echoey.
Where are the speakers?
Speaker is here and on the balcony on the other side.
What kind of speakers are there?
They're amplified, so that's actually we turn the gain down a little bit so you don't hear the amplification, but you would normally hear this. They're a bit overkill for speaking. They're more like concert speakers.
Right.
You know, they're a bit beefed up. But your work sounds great. Soon, yeah, probably. You started to bring her around.
Sculpture. I didn't take any pictures. I just made the recording.
We're gonna go in and take some pictures of you doing it, okay?
Okay.
Because I sent the camera.
This is the sound of the Richard Serra sculpture. With its seismic accelerometer. Isn't that amazing? I saw some of these. Is there any water or bottles of water?
Absolutely.
It's nice.
What's nice about the online class is there's students from every walk of life you can imagine. So math, geography, psychology, you know, engineering, physics. I think they're actually in some ways more complex. Our students tend to come up with things, ideas, like inside.
You know, I'm interested in getting art students to really think about ideas,
I know,
because I think that's the source of
that's the
making their art.
source of that.
And if you're just in this insular world, just in your imagination, you're really closing yourself.
You can't benefit others more inspiring. Looking at a reality in a different way. Okay, so, right? Hi, what's your name? Leah. New York? Vienna. What's that for? Aha, okay. We have some snacks here because it's lunchtime, so you must start. I'm gonna start 5 minutes after noon. We're gonna start right on time, just because there's students here who have classes and other things to do. Hey, I'm so glad you're here.
Is Bill here?
Huh?
Where's Bill?
He just walked out to get some
Oh,
water. We're all set.
All right.
And you're in for a very nice treat. He recorded the Sarah sculpture. That sounds amazing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. Did you tell your class to come?
I don't teach structural graduate class at all this time. I only teach grads, grad two.
Well,
tutorials.
grads I'm
But
talking
I
about.
sent them an message, but I don't know.
I don't know what to say.
Not to say, they're difficult.
I mean, how often can you meet Bill and talk to him? I
That's the
had
thing,
about 6 of them did one-on-one
Did you tell the,
reviews.
did you tell the grads especially about this too?
Absolutely, repeatedly, until I feel like I'm blue in my face.
I know. Same thing.
That's
What
life.
type of
It's okay.
kind of something.
Hi, do you need help to find it?
Thanks for the wine.
I'll give a short introduction. Okay, we're ready to start. Welcome, everybody. It's so good to see you here on first week of school. A particular warm welcome to my online class, Art, Science, and Technology Introduction. It's so great to meet most of you. If I haven't met you, welcome, and it's always great and fun to see people in person when you're doing online classes. I'm super excited to have Bill Fontana here with us. He crosses over boundaries in ways that Art Science Center is particularly interested in. And recently, he was an artist in residence in CERN, which is a huge physics facility in Europe. And he got a big prize, golden Nika for this at the Ars Electronica, which you'll learn about a little more. But I'll give you a little bit of a background of Bill Fontana. And I think you're really having a treat here to start your school and this kind of topic at this particular point. Fontana had his education, his early education at the New School for Social Research in New York. It's a famous school for social studies, but also art and music, and he studied music and philosophy there. He traveled to Australia, stayed in Japan and Germany early on composing. And in the early 70s, he's actually a pioneer of doing sound sculptures, looking at environments and physical spaces like this one, and really thinking about sound in ways that are much deeper. So today he actually will have a nice treat for you, which I'm not going to let you in on, but he was recording around here something that when you come out, you may experience very differently once you hear it. He has made works all over the world, and currently is doing a piece in Venice, not here in California, in Italy, for the Architectural Biennale. That's a recording of a building, and we're going to hear something about this too. So to not go too further into the work, because there's a lot of it. It's 50 years of amazing pioneering work that's surely going to be inspiring to all of you, and it is to me continuously. So please give him a very warm, thunderous applause.
Thank you for coming during the lunch hour to hear me speak. Can you hear me?
You'll have to speak there, yeah.
All right.
Sorry.
For all the work with sound I do, I hate talking into microphones.
We should have gotten you.
I began, as Victoria mentioned, about 50 years ago, in the mid-late 60s. I grew up in Cleveland, and I lived within walking distance to the Cleveland Orchestra and the Cleveland Museum of Art. And the Vietnam War was going on when I was in college, and I was enrolled part-time as a philosophy major in a small college in Cleveland, and I was also a composition student at the Cleveland Institute of Music. And what started to really fascinate me was listening, because in the situations when I was attempting to write music or create music, I had to have a kind of hyper focus. And when I was in that state of mind, in the silences between the music I was trying to create, my perception of sound, ambient sound in the space I was working, really changed, and I started to become very interested in how my ability to focus and listen was a way of really creating music. And I started using whatever portable recording means were available to me to start to record those moments when the world seemed especially interesting and musical, just with the sounds. But I remember a music theory instructor at the Cleveland Institute of Music asking me what my philosophy of music was at composition. And I told him that the act of listening was a way of making music. And he looked at me like I was really strange, or maybe getting stoned too much or something. And I decided I needed to get out of Cleveland. And I discovered that John Cage was teaching a class at the New School in New York called Experimental Music Composition. So I decided to leave Cleveland, transfer to the New School, and I took that class. Cage was actually very seldom there because he was very famous and very busy at that time. But what he did for me, and what some of the people who worked with him did for me, is they took me seriously at a time that I needed that. And the other thing that happened in New York in 1968 that was kind of a life-changing experience is at the Museum of Modern Art, there was an exhibition called The Machine Show. And it was the first time in my life I'd seen any of Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades. It was also the first time I saw his bride stripped bare by her bachelor's even. And in his notes, in the notebook he created that accompanied that artwork, there's a famous passage which you can see on the screen: musical sculpture, sounds lasting and leaving, forming and sounding a sculpture which lasts. And when I read that and thinking about kind of the ideas I was starting to have in the Cage class and with my own experiences recording sound, the idea that sound was like this physical medium that could redefine and change your relationships to spaces seemed really significant. And it was at that point in my life that I started to call the work I was doing sound sculptures. You know, it really came from Duchamp. But what I wanted to play for you, just before I get started, is this morning before I was talking, I was outside, and I put an interesting object on the Richard Serra sculpture. I'll just show this to you. This object is called the seismic accelerometer. It's a measurement instrument that structural engineers use to measure the vibration in structures and things. I put this magnetically mounted this on Serra sculpture to record how the Serra sculpture was listening and reacting to just the ambient sound outside. So I just want to share that recording with you. So what's really interesting about this is the simple physics of the situation. because if you have two identical tuning forks, you strike one, the second one starts to vibrate. The Richard Serra sculpture has a harmonic structure inside of it. There are certain frequencies at which it would like to vibrate, and the ambient sound field is this random mixture of many different frequencies. The frequencies outside that relate to the overtone structure of the sculpture excite it. Of course, nobody can hear that or know that normally because you can't physically get inside of a Richard Serra sculpture, but a seismic accelerometer can virtually do that. And so what you're hearing is a harmonic echo of the environment outside of here as it excites the internal resonances of that sculpture. But actually, everything you see, every structure you see, is like this in some way. I was listening to woodpeckers outside this morning, and I was imagining if I had the time, I would love to put a seismic accelerometer on a tree that's being pecked by woodpecker, which would be pretty interesting. I'm going to go back in time a little bit. When in 1981, I did one of my first public sound sculptures in the US in San Francisco that's actually been reinstalled at Fort Mason. And what it was a real-time kind of sound map of San Francisco Bay. So you got sound art outside. And it's Fort Mason is over here, and these circles represent positions where there were live microphones transmitting to a series of speakers on the outside of the pier at Fort Mason. And these things indicate foghorns. And so I was interested in the real-time sound delays that the foghorns would be generated to hear them simultaneously from these different vantage points. This was 1981, and the method of transmission was analog telephone lines. And this is what it's sounded like. So if you're in San Francisco, you can go to Fort Mason, and this one is close to that. Those recordings were installed on the outside of there too. I don't like standing behind podiums. So that's all. It's friendlier this way, I think. But in that place at Fort Mason, you can naturally hear the foghorns in the bay when they're active. And so it becomes an interesting conversation between the sound of the bay in 1981 and the sound of the bay in 2018. So this image is a Buddhist temple, a 1,000-year-old Buddhist temple bell in Kyoto at Nanzenji. It rings, I think it rings once a year on New Year's Eve. And I did a similar recording of this bell that I had just done with the Richard Serra sculpture. bell as a hanging object is much more elastic than the Sarah sculpture, which is sitting on the ground. So it actually is much freer to vibrate. This is one of the bells on the top of the old Met Life Tower, 23rd and Madison Avenue. There are 4 clock bells there that started measuring time in 1909. That building has been turned into a luxury hotel, and they don't ring the clock bells any longer. But I went up there and made extensive recordings of the sound of the 4 bells on the Met Life Tower not ringing. I've been trying for about a year to see if I could do a real-time piece in New York with this, but people don't seem to quite understand why somebody would want to listen to the sound of silence. So I'm going to play you this bell listening to New York City. For a long time, I've been very interested in using accelerometers in my work as a way to sort of reveal the inner voices of structures. And bridges are especially interesting structures to do that with. And in 2006, I was lucky enough to be able to do an installation in the Turbine Hall of Tate Modern, in which I took the Millennium Bridge, designed by Norman Foster, and turned it into a live musical instrument, installed a network of accelerometers on the cables of structure, and transmitted it to a large speaker system in the Turbine Hall. And it was like a living work of art. It was because the sound changed a lot with the weather, the number of people walking on the bridge if it was raining. And I will just play you a couple of examples of what that sounded like. Also, at this time, something that was starting to change in my work is I started exploring the relationship between sound and moving image. And I started doing video studies of the Millennium Bridge. And you're going to see one of those. Here's another one. last year, for all of last year, I was very involved with a large exhibition project in Lisbon for a new contemporary art museum called MAT, which stands for Museum of Art, Architecture, and Technology. And standing in front of this museum, you see this river, which is the entrance of the Lisbon Harbor. And that bridge is called the 25th of April Bridge. And it's a very iconic structure in Lisbon. And the name of the bridge comes from their revolution when they overthrew a dictator named Salazar. And it's a bridge that you can see everywhere in the city center of Lisbon. You can actually hear it because it has a steel grid road surface that kind of oscillates. And the museum asked me to make a project with about this bridge. And what was important for me was because it was a young museum, they gave me a kind of freedom to experiment that maybe an older, more established museum wouldn't have allowed me. And that bridge really, for about a year and a half, became my studio. I climbed all over the structure of that bridge, recorded it in every possible way, and was able, in an 800 square meter gallery space in Lisbon, create a 7-channel video piece and a 32-channel sound piece, which was all with live streaming media data coming from a fiber optic network that they had put on the bridge. But the first thing I saw when I walked onto the bridge was the first time when I went on a catwalk that was underneath the roadway. I saw the most amazing visual spectacle of shadows. One of the most interesting places on the bridge was the top of the South Tower, where I was able to install a very nice surveillance camera, just gazing with this view. And what I liked about this in a live installation is the look of this would really change with the time of day and the light and the weather. Here, it was a foggy day. Here, it's a sort of sunny afternoon, and this one on the right side was late at night. And I had extensive recordings from this camera, and I'm going to reconfigure this and maybe make an installation where you'll see a whole bunch of these vertical views of the bridge. It's been very interesting to edit this, but I'm going to just let you hear this. This is how the gallery looked with all the video screens. itself, that live camera from the top of the bridge was, looked like this in the space. It was projected onto this enormous hanging screen that was at a 45-degree angle, and I'll play this for you. Spent recording and studying this bridge. I experimented a lot with exploring the kind of geometry of the structure of the bridge, and this was one of the videos I really found interesting. This was also in that exhibition. Besides the sounds of the bridge itself, I also had live hydrophones, underwater microphones in the river Tagus that passes in front of the museum. And this is, the image here is a shadow of the bridge in the river. So, I'm going to go from Lisbon to Venice, where I'm in the process of creating an exhibition that's going to open at the end of May in the Architecture Biennale called Primal Sonic Visions. And this it was a very unusual project for me because it was commissioned by an organization called the International Renewable Energy Agency. And what they wanted me to do was travel to different countries and make sound recordings and digital films about renewable energy power sources and to do it in a non-documentary kind of way to sort of, and to create an immersive art experience in a very public context like the Venice Biennale, to really engage in a wider kind of public discussion about the importance of renewable energy. And the theme of the Architecture Biennale this year is sustainability. And so I'm just going to share with you some of these adventures I had recording these in Iceland and all over Europe and California. This was a kind of conceptual statement I'd written, and you have to imagine what it felt like to be in Iceland or Western Tuscany recording geothermal power plants, when you think that this energy and this heat is coming from the core of the earth, and that it can be harnessed to generate electricity and a very clean kind of energy. It was really pretty inspiring to me. This image is in Western Tuscany. The first geothermal power plants in the world were built in Tuscany, and the first one opened in 1909. And if you travel through that landscape, it's just amazing. You see, the steam kind of rising out of the earth everywhere. And the way I recorded it is I would take the same kind of accelerometer I was using with the Sarah sculpture and kind of take several of them and just put them on the earth, just to listen to that energy coming out of the ground. And the camera was a fixed view camera that had the same view recorded at different times of day. And what I did was I just took these multiple views and layered them on top of each other. Because the way I often work with sound when I'm mixing is to combine sounds. And I started really, for myself, experimenting doing that with the videos. Geothermal power plant in Western Tuscany, you see these cooling towers, and surrounding the cooling tower, you've got this very dynamic landscape, and the way the multiple view with this, when it was layered, it kind of started looking like some kind of representation of heat and energy. this is another geothermal cooling tower. This was at a coastal location in Tuscany. So, besides geothermal, I spent some time recording wind turbines. And I found a particularly interesting one in northern England where it was actually possible for me to climb to the very top of the wind turbine underneath the blades. And this is what it looked like. It was an adventure. But in Portugal, I visited a wind farm that was in a nature reserve near a religious pilgrimage site called Fatima. And it was really surprising to see a bunch of wind turbines in a nature reserve. So this nature reserve was full of birds, and they didn't seem to be disturbed at all by the fact that you had these giant wind turbines. So I spent a lot of time there, and I made this really kind of, in some ways, it was real experiment for me making this, because it's multiple views of several wind turbines. And I also made dawn recordings of birds in this place, and I just mixed these all together. Very different kind of place was Iceland. Iceland is a very strange landscape because there's no trees, and I went to some areas that I really felt like I was on another planet, but I found a very beautiful old hydroelectric power plant, and I did this in a way that I was just sort of finding the way in this video, the way it made me feel to be there in this situation. The sound is coming from hydrophones, picking up the sound of the outflow of the hydroelectric power plant. So you're hearing moving water, but you're also hearing the turbine as it sounds underwater. And then it's superimposed on just this view of this very extraterrestrial landscape. Austria, near the city of Graz, there was a really interesting wastewater treatment plant that generated its own electricity from processing this. And when they cleaned the wastewater that was going into this, they returned the water to the river that goes through Graz called the River Mur. And there was this large turbine that the water passed through to return to the river. And it wasn't a sealed turbine. You could actually see the blades of the turbine spinning. And the sound of it was pretty impressive. But this is generating electricity. Back in Portugal, there was a hydroelectric power plant kind of in the mountains near a city called Porto. And I also kind of did this the same way I did the hydroelectric power plant in Iceland. And the sound is coming, from the outflow, and it's a collage. If any of you are going to be in the vicinity of Venice this summer, I would would invite you to go and see my exhibition. It's in a wonderful building on the Grand Canal near the Peggy Guggenheim Museum. It's a university called Acoustical, and they have like a whole exhibition pavilion. And so these videos and some other ones will be kind of spread out in this old building, and there's going to be an immersive sound piece that travels through the building. I'm going to have live hydrophones in the Grand Canal. And I'm also working on a project for this somewhat controversial flood barrier system called MOSE that's being constructed in Venice. I'm going to have some footage and sounds, about that project. I actually have, further on in the slideshow, I have a video of one of these strange, giant flood barrier gates being lowered into one of the inlets of the Venice Lagoon. Maybe I'll just show you that. So this is part of the flood barrier system in Venice. So if I were to play this whole video for you, this giant yellow structure slowly disappears into the I'll leave it running while we talk. I'm wondering if any of you have any questions.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. May I ask, have you ever tried or thought of listening to the unknown?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Examples?
Well, for the first time I put an accelerometer on a Buddhist temple bell. I could imagine what it might do, but I didn't know for a fact actually what the sound was going to be. And it's sort of like you have an idea of something.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe one of the most surprising ones, I don't have it here to play for you, but I did an exhibition in Abu Dhabi in 2014, and they asked me to do a project about something kind of about that world, that environment. And what seemed especially interesting to me were the deserts. So I went into the desert quite a bit, and I wanted to find the voice of the desert. And as you might imagine, I buried accelerometers in the sand dunes. And the sound that I discovered there sounded like waves on a beach.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that desert there was millions of years ago actually underwater. It was the floor of the sea, so it seemed to me like I was hearing kind of the ghost of a sea that had once been there.
Mm-hmm. Have you, for instance, thought of listening to a crowd of faithful in St. Peter's Square versus a crowd in Times Square in New York to see whether a crowd of faithful has a characteristically different sound?
No, but I think that's it. I think that's an interesting idea. Maybe we can do that.
Have you thought of listening to smog?
To smog?
Yeah. You know, there's an inversion layer, and if you shoot sound, it would require making the sound yourself, like I think in San Francisco Bay. If you shoot the sound up to the inversion layer, it's going to come down different than it went up. Just the thought crossed my mind while I'm being inspired by your examples.
Well, to really do that, one would have to really put a lot of thought into the kind of listening network you would create.
Yeah, exactly.
To hear that. And
Exactly.
what I'm imagining is you might have balloons that have microphones on them that are
Yeah.
transmitting, hovering, in a certain environment, and that are kind of monitoring just the ambient sound that's floating up, and then you could maybe hear something like that.
Thanks.
Yes, what we just heard was a nice conversation between Dr. Putterman, who's a physicist here on campus, and was very generous to let us come with Bill Fontana to the anechoic chamber that's here. So that was fantastic. And I have a sense there may be a collaboration here
I
happening.
hope so. I hope
Art
so.
science collaboration between these two guys.
Yeah, who's in charge of putting these cameras up? And
Who's asking the question?
right here in the back.
Hi,
Yeah, who goes up on the cables and the
I
wind
do.
turbine?
I do.
How do you have to get a license, or how do they just let you climb up
I
there?
had to sign a document that said if I died, they weren't responsible. But I mean, I had a team of people with me, of course, and it was very official kind of undertaking. It wasn't, it's not a place that people can normally access. And but I like to do things myself. I don't like kind of having other people make my art for me. I mean, I have people assisting me, but I finally like to really do it myself whenever possible.
So did you climb up all the way on that cable?
Well, you don't
Or
have
the
to
bridge?
climb that cable to go up there. It's actually what you do is on the road level of the bridge, you get inside of a miniature elevator that goes about halfway up into the tower. The tower narrows, and then you get out, and there's vertical ladders, and you climb through a series of vertical ladders in this rather claustrophobic steel tower, and then you come up on the top of it with the most breathtaking views. And so I spent a lot of time up there making test recordings and videos to figure out a camera angle that would make sense. And then it was an engineering thing with the telecom company to put a fiber network on the bridge.
Yeah, that was what I was going to ask, is how you're getting the sound live through it. I mean, you're running a cable all the way. That's one of it.
The Portuguese telecom company installed a fiber optic network, and there were network switches in different parts of the bridge. So, and the kind of camera that was on the top of the bridge was a surveillance camera, which is a kind of camera that's designed to connect to a network. And so that, I mean, it wasn't that difficult.
I should say thank you very much for an exceptional body of work, because sound is very new to me, maybe in only the last 10 years, and you've been an excellent reference going back for my own stuff. But I have, maybe it's a trivial question, but the bridge and the shadow, why was that video not stabilized? Did you want that to have what it's actually, the movement?
There's so much vibration
Right.
in that structure, and it just was virtually impossible to really stabilize it. When I experimented with stabilizing it, the results really weren't satisfactory. It introduced a lot of kind of video distortion with the camera trying to stabilize it, and it was into a situation where I could bring a kind of really heavy-duty tripod. And actually, I thought it was really the nature of that structure.
Sorry, what is? That's okay. The microphones in the water. Where do you just drop them in the water, or you get some into the structure?
Well, they were dropped in the water, but they were kind of tied to an underwater structure. And what was really funny in Lisbon, because it was this very kind of official kind of project, and there were all these different agencies involved with it. The Portuguese Navy installed the hydrophones. And they had this whole diving team that went, and it was, it was very interesting to work with them.
So Bill, so much of your work deals with the sort of like either human-made infrastructures or natural environments and sort of like, but there are other sort of like music concrete people like Luc Ferrari who are very involved with the human voice, and seems like the human voice plays a rather peripheral role in your work. So I would be just interested in just hearing from you. So the role of the human voice in your work, does it have any role really at all?
Well, the role that it has is as a sound in a space. If I'm working with a space that has people in it, and I had done a lot of recordings in wonderful markets in Paris and Italy, and used some of that material in installations. But I had never actually, in a real-time piece, it had live sound from a situation where there were a lot of people, maybe live microphones in front of in the Vatican, in that large square. Might be interesting.
But I think there was one piece that I remember a long time ago to which I took part, which was your something called Music for Ordinary Objects,
That's
or something
oh my
like
God.
that.
Oh my, that goes
where
back.
you
That
actually
goes back a
were
long
in
way.
a radio studio at the ORF, and you asked people to either to send their voice or
A
clinging
sound.
their beer bottle or whatever, and you were mixing these and sending them out through radio.
Yeah.
So
That was like when was it? 1986, 86.
that's when we first met.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's an, and can I ask a very brief, because I know that Bill has done many other type of work as well. So this did not cover at all, just a small fraction of your work. So your work with these sound bridges, so where you basically used to swap sound environments between two or multiple locations. So would you like to say something about that side of your work?
Well, one of the reasons this was interesting for me to do is I think real time, is something working in a time-based medium that's always fascinated me. And I had the chance in 1987 to do a project for a broadcasting company in Germany called Westdeutscher Rundfunk, where it was called the Cologne San Francisco Sound Bridge. And so I had a live kind of sound piece at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and I'd created a live sound piece in Cologne at the Museum Ludwig, and with WDR, we did a live radio concert that connected in real time the city of Cologne and San Francisco. And it was heard throughout Europe. It was heard through the public broadcasting network in the U.S. And it was this sense of really connecting in a very special way to this real moment that these sounds were happening. But I think my interest in real time came about especially when I lived in Australia, because I had this amazing job in the 70s where I was working for the Australian Broadcasting Company, and my job was to record what Australia sounded like. And in 1976, there was a total eclipse of the sun in a rainforest. And I went there to make a recording to find out what effect a total eclipse was going to have on birds in the rainforest. And it was so extraordinary, because in the minutes before an eclipse, as the shadows started to shimmer in this old growth rainforest, the birds didn't know what time it was anymore. And they all started singing together. And then when the total eclipse arrived, it was like a light switch, and it just suddenly got dark. And that moment, in that particular spot, I learned was going to happen. The next time it was going to happen was going to be in 5,000 years. And that just so blew me away, and made me really think that real time is like the most interesting way to make an artwork.
So I've been, your voice and your speaking is very soothing and the volume is very different. So I wanted to know how this work influenced your listening and your own speaking voice, because that's been on my mind the whole time as you were talking and listening and showing videos. It's a personal question, but I really like it.
You like the sound of my voice?
Yes, but it's like, I wonder how
I wish my wife did.
No, but the way you talk is very different. Some people are very not aware. I wonder if you are aware of that or not, and how it influenced your own voice, your own sound.
I think so.
Your own listening.
I think so. I think, though, when I'm in situations like this where I'm playing these sounds and talking, I have a different speaking voice than I have maybe one-to-one. I don't know. But I think, when I think about the human voice, it's like someone's breath, it's someone's being, it's someone's energy, and and I feel obviously very connected to my own body and my voice and the sound of it. And I mean, maybe that's not a very good answer to your question.
No, I just thought like ahead. I thought if it influenced your own like voicing, your own sound.
I think it happens kind of unconsciously.
Yeah. I just find that interesting.
So, a couple quarters ago, Professor Urki showed us some of your work, and it was mainly the Golden Gate Bridge one.
Uh-huh.
But when I was looking at the Iceland work that you've done, it looks so much more digitally produced and
it is
collaged.
Yeah.
So
I had never done that before.
It took me by surprise. But I had two questions to ask. First was, do you consider the Icelandic work that you're doing sound sculpture as well? And the second would be, how do you see the instruments you use to like compile these different different collections of experiences? Do you see it limiting or like affecting how we experience your work?
I don't see it as limiting. For me, it's been a real expansion, and with like the kind of stuff you saw from Iceland or Tuscany, I felt I was given a challenge by this organization to do something, and I wanted to reinvent myself. And the way it would actually be exhibited is very different than this, because the sound is going to be moving in a space and create a real sort of immersive experience, and you'll see a lot of these images together, and it's and the way I started exploring making these video collages, I mean, I'd never done anything like that before, and in a way, because I had never done anything like that before, and I didn't really, I was doing it kind of with a certain ignorance about the history of the medium, and that kind of freed me to really just follow my, my instincts. But I have instincts that go back 50 years as an artist, and so, I mean, I've gotten pretty surprising and positive reactions to people who've known my work for a long time. They see these, so I'm a little bit scared about suddenly showing all this kind of stuff in Venice in this pretty public situation, but we'll see what happens.
Okay, I'll take this one, I guess. Well, thank you. One last suggestion from me. Next collaboration should be somebody videotaping you on bridges and turbines and wherever you end up going. I'm so curious about the process. I feel like the process is real time and it's part of the work.
Yeah,
and
it
it
is.
would be pretty amazing to have that documented. So hopefully sometime you actually have somebody climb with you and
Yeah, that
one
was-
of the people who's assisting you.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much for being here. I know a lot of you have to rush to classes, and for my students in Desmond 9, if you want to grab a picture with Bill Fontana, it's going to be a nice one. And applause. Thank you. Yeah, it was fantastic. Just on the way out, the large steel structure is by sculptor Sarah, and that was what Bill Fontana recorded. So the